We are now recording the meeting. We've been asked to do that, so I hope everyone's okay with that. Yeah, we feel we've got a strong track record and a lot of experience tackling poverty. But we know that we're not necessarily leaders or experts in rural poverty in particular. People have been raising the issue, asking us questions about it at events and places. We've been working with people recently. And we know that there are a lot of unique challenges around rural poverty, and it tends to be sidelined as an issue with a lot of focus on the experience of people in the cities and in estates. But there has been a lot of interesting work being done on rural poverty recently. There was a report that made the pages of The Guardian just yesterday, looking at how so many rural communities are food deserts, and there's a really high risk of food insecurity for people in those areas. There's also a couple of pieces of research we're going to tell you about today that Stephanie Denning has been leading on, and people in Cornwall have been doing some really interesting research and reports. So, knowing that we're not experts and leaders in this field, we just wanted to create a space, bring people together, make sure that everyone gets a chance to hear some of the interesting work that has been going on, and then see what connections can be created, get people talking about this. So we're happy to just be here to give a platform and space for discussion, and we want to acknowledge where the real expertise lies. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Gav, who's put this together, to explain a bit about what we're going to do today. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Liam. Hi, everybody. Yes, we've got three sort of talks, presentations by the people that Liam mentioned from Cornwall, Cumbria, and the Cotswolds. The alliteration was accidental, not deliberate. We're then going to go into two separate breakout rooms. The breakout sessions are fundamentally the same, but the main point of today is to enable connections and get people meeting new people and chatting and seeing what can be done. So we thought doing two small groups was the best way to enable that, so that people can meet as many different people as possible. When we come back from the breakouts, there's going to be sort of open conversation focusing on what people think the government should maybe do differently to address rural poverty, what the churches at sort of national denomination level could maybe be doing differently, and what charities such as ourselves and other Christian social justice charities might look to do differently to ensure that rural poverty is given the attention it needs and the solutions it needs. At the end, I know that some people always sort of make an exit when we go to breakout rooms for varying reasons. So just want to say that at the end, one of the things we really want to do is to enable people to swap contact details and keep in touch afterwards if they want to. So we'll send an email out tomorrow asking if people to say whether they're happy to swap details, either with everyone who's here or with particular people who you maybe had a conversation with in the breakout rooms. And we'll also, this recording will go on the Church Action on Poverty Facebook page later today or tomorrow, and it'd be great if we can continue some of the conversation on there as well, so that yourselves and people who've missed today's meeting but are interested can also join in with that. I'm going to hand over initially to Stephanie Denning, and while I do that, I'm going to quickly make sure I've got the slides ready that I need for this part. Just bear with me a second.
Thank you, Gemma.
Here we go. Are people seeing those slides? Yep, excellent. Stephanie, just let me know when you want to move on from each one.
Thank you. Are you able to go into, if you go into slideshow, then there should be presentation view. That's okay.
Yes, sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry, I can't see the menus because of the Zoom bar at the top.
Yeah, just from beginning is great. Thank you.
That's it.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So Hello, everybody. Nice to meet you, albeit online. My name is Dr. Stephanie Denning, and I'm an assistant professor at Coventry University. I'm going to share very quickly a little bit about the hidden hardship research that I have undertaken. This was a research project funded by the British Academy that aimed to understand people's experiences of living in hardship in the rural North Cotswolds. So the next slide, thank you. So the problem of rural hardship. 17% of households in rural England are experiencing relative poverty after housing costs. And rural areas of the UK are UK cold spots for social mobility and areas of entrenched deprivation, meaning that it's difficult for people living in poverty in rural areas to move out of poverty. So this research looked at the North Cotswolds, at an anonymous town and an anonymous village, and they were anonymous at the request of my participants. You'll notice that we are using the term hardship rather than poverty. And I felt that that was less stigmatizing for using participatory research. People were more willing to engage with the term hardship than poverty. And I think that also got to that hidden aspect. So very briefly, how I undertook the research. First, my research assistant and I did community profiles of the rural town and village that we were focusing on. Then for the participatory research, I attended local community groups and gatherings in that town and village. Some were targeted responses to hardship, such as the food bank, but it was also important to go to things like the toddler group and different kind of community gatherings where people were going maybe as a response to hardship in terms of their day-to-day coping with hardship, but it was a real mixing place of people, so it wasn't just those targeted responses. At those different groups, I undertook 22 interviews with people responding to hardship or experiencing hardship, and of course someone could be in both of those categories. I then worked in more depth with 3 households experiencing hardship, and the adults in those households, who all happened to be women, wrote diaries for 1 month of their experiences of hardship, and with each household I did 3 go-along interviews. A go-along interview being kind of what it sounds like, that you do an interview as you go about an activity. So one was going around the supermarket talking about their experience of shopping. Another, I joined an art session. Real names are used in this presentation with permission or pseudonyms. So onto the next slide. What is rural hardship? Hardship was defined by my participants as struggle. And all of these illustrations in the slides are, I should say, are by Beth Waters, and they're illustrations of extracts from participants' interviews or diaries. Participants talked about being isolated physically and feeling trapped in the situations. One participant said that hardship is, quote, very little resistance when things go wrong. And we're talking here about financial hardship, but not just finances. So it was also just how it was affecting someone's entire day-to-day life. Causes of hardship include low income, rising cost of living not matched by income, lack of local employment opportunities, illness, particularly mental health as well as physical health, rural isolation and lack of services, including a lack of transport, and several participants talked about a family breakdown, including the death of their partner. So on the next slide, we start thinking about how people experienced hardship. Kate, who is illustrated in this slide, talked about switching from fresh milk to powdered milk because the fresh milk in the local shop was too expensive. Powdered milk was cheaper, but she said it wasn't very filling, and she often went to bed hungry. So people talked about cutting down on their spending, on their heating and on their bills, and this nature of hidden hardship. So the Cotswolds is not a place that you generally consider hardship existing. So people talked about feeling judged in a wealthy area and embarrassment and experiencing hardship alongside wealthier peers. People's experiences of hardship, a lot was linked to a low income, so lack of income either from benefits, but also from seasonal work and low paid work. If we turn to the next slide. Thank you. This is how people navigated hardship. So in brief, some general points. People talked about navigating hardship. They showed great resilience and perseverance, took one day at a time, and careful budgeting decisions with a constant eye on their bank balance. Community spirit was really important for how people navigated hardship, not necessarily in organised groups, but also just groups of houses and with amongst neighbours. People placed huge importance upon their family and friends. So the illustration here is Claire. She had a freezer in her downstairs toilet, and that freezer was full of food that was for herself, but also for her friends and neighbours. People would knock on her door and say, "Claire, I haven't got enough to eat tonight. Could I have something from the freezer, please?" And she had a friend that worked in the large Aldi, and her friend at the end of the day would buy everything at sort of 75% reduction, and they would fill the freezer. Claire was experiencing hardship herself, also worked in organised groups and also in these informal ways to help people. So family and friends were a huge way that people were emotionally and practically supporting each other. But then at the same time, other participants talked about not wanting to burden their family or friends or not wanting to share because of shame in their situation. So on the next slide, thank you. Here we've got Julie. So Julie, I met her on a Tuesday and she said that she had £5 for the whole week left. And that was because she just filled her car with petrol and she needed her car to get to work. She was a part-time teacher. So that's the image on the left. On the right, we've got the warm place where I met her, where she was having a free meal. At that point, it was winter time, it was cold. And she had also been to the food bank. And so the food bank was going to get her through that week until she was next paid. So on paper, it could look like there were a large number of groups supporting people, but there were kind of a number of things that complicated this. First, people could be reluctant to use the groups in small rural communities, everyone knowing each other's business. You didn't necessarily want to be seen at the food bank or for others to know your situation if you were trying to hide that from others. One lady that I met at the food bank, I knew having seen her regularly at the warm place, and she told me that it was her first time going to the food bank and she'd actually invented a story that she was going to share if she met anyone else that she knew at the food bank, of why she was there to get some food for a friend. So she was too embarrassed to want to tell other people that actually the food was for herself, whereas obviously the food bank volunteers knew that the food actually was for her. So the food bank was often a last resort. Participants also talked about the church and their faith as support, both as sort of community support and friends, but also access to local grants and initiatives. But again, that was a lot about awareness. But at the same time, inequality did exist within church congregations, with not necessarily good levels of awareness of hardship amongst the overall congregation, and issues of stereotyping. So finally, the project looked at barriers to well-being, what's stopping hardship from improving. People couldn't always envisage how their situations could change, which in itself is a barrier for the future. And I hear talk about lacks of as barriers for the future. So services stopping, including transport, lack of government investment and a focus on tourism instead, low benefit rates, lack of affordable housing, lack of affordable shops, and lack of local secure employment. So on the Hidden Hardship website, which we can put a link to in the chat, there is a briefing that gives different policy recommendations, which perhaps we can talk about later, of the project's engaged local policy leaders and national policy leaders. I particularly like to highlight, though, the devotional study guide, which is also available on the website. And this was produced after the initial project to resource churches and congregations to tackle hardship in their local areas. And the study guide is a guide to be used as individuals rather than in a home group. And that's because if you are experiencing hardship, perhaps in isolation from the rest of your congregation, or as a minority, you may not want initially to be discussing your experiences of hardship. That could be quite awkward if you've kept your experiences to yourself. So the study guide follows 10 days of biblical reflections, quotes from the participants to work through initially how do we understand hardship, and then at the end it moves to taking action to tackle hardship, and that's where it moves from being as an individual to working together with others. That is everything from me for now, so thank you. I look forward to more conversations later, and I'm going to hand over now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was great. And good morning, everybody. My name's Paul Phillips. I am the Social Responsibility Officer for the Diocese of Truro. My role focuses on social justice within the diocese and looks to point to Jesus' words for Christians to proclaim good news to the poor. So in September 2025, an academic report was published and launched in St Denis, a small village of around 3,000 people in rural Cornwall. The venue was the local football club hospitality building, overlooked by rolling green hills dotted with sheep, and the recycling and recovery centre incinerator towers. Perhaps not the most impressive setting, but certainly a relevant one. The report, called Pretty Poverty, Cornwall Rurality Matters, was commissioned by the Diocese of Truro and supported and carried out by Plymouth Marjon University. It shines a light on how the IMD, or Index of Multiple Deprivation, the government's standard measure of poverty, is inadequately representing poverty in rural contexts, specifically Cornwall. The IMD, for those of you needing a little bit of a refresher, as I did, is the official measure of rural deprivation at small area level and is designed to identify 32,844 lower layer super output areas, or LSOAs, where there are 39 indicators of deprivation categorized across the following 7 domains: income, employment, health deprivation and disability, education, skills training, crime, barriers to housing and services, and living environment. The IMD findings are used to inform the distribution of government resources and funding with the aim of ensuring those who are most in need benefit from these resources. The Pretty Poverty Report is the result of an 18-month-long research project led by Professor Tanya Ovenden Hope with researchers Victoria Brown and Elpida Akhtaradu, and it explores the lived experience of people in 6 rural areas from across Cornwall: St Blaise West, St Day, St Buryan and Sennen, Bodmin St Mary's Ward, St Denis South, Looe North, and St Mary, while considering how the IMD reflects these experiences as the government's measure for disadvantage. All these communities ranked in the bottom 20 to 30% of disadvantaged communities and had an isolated primary school. And this is all based on the now previous IMD published in 2019. The most recent was published in October of last year. The researchers point to key technical flaws, including the use of large areas that mask pockets of hardship, and a system that gives too little weight to issues that hit rural areas hardest, such as poor transport links. Transport barriers account for just 9.3% of one part of the IMD, even though access to transport is a major factor shaping quality of life in rural areas, as I expect we all know. Misunderstanding the importance of a car in rural areas is a glaring error in the government data. It is not a sign of wealth or luxury, but an essential tool to enable people to travel around rural areas without having to depend on shaky or non-existent public transport or the kindness and availability of friends and family. Owning a car with road tax, insurance, and general upkeep costs imposes a rural tax on people who live outside of cities and larger towns. Camborne and Redruth MP Perrin Moon, who wrote the foreword for the report, said, "Those of us who live in Cornwall see and feel the effects of pretty poverty every day, realities that visitors often miss. No single sweeping reform, no matter how radical, can reset the pressures that Cornwall faces. But central government should be deeply concerned that remote coastal deprivation, as detailed in this report, is not adequately captured by current indicators. The oversight disadvantages people facing educational isolation, barriers to services, and precarious employment. While the IMD has its strengths, relying solely on it risks overlooking the deep structural issues affecting our communities." So these were the findings, and I'm sure for most of you, they are not going to be a surprise. Transport dependency. Transport came up time and time again in interviews and was found to create an additional rural tax, as transport costs are invisible to income measures. Transport itself is inadequate and unreliable in rural communities, and the seasonality of public transport is such that 2/3 of people live in transport deserts. Housing displacement. There are 20,000 homes out of residential use in Cornwall, with second homes and holiday lets creating intense competition for homes. And I want to make it really clear, we're talking about homes, not houses or housing, but homes. And this is a key distinction. Employment precarity. 26.5% of Cornwall's population earn below real living wage, which is £13.45 an hour. Geographic constraints limit career development, transport again, and the tourism-dependent economy creates seasonal instability and underemployment. Healthcare withdrawal. Healthcare service centralisation compounds geographic barriers, there's transport again, and digital exclusion affects older residents accessing online services. Cornwall's internet speed is 29% worse than the UK average. Not to mention dental care, or lack thereof, and the increased travel distances for specialist care. Educational isolation. There is a higher than average special needs concentration in rural schools, with transport barriers, again, limiting educational access and leading to constrained aspirations affecting multiple generations. And community resilience. There is, however, strong social capital and mutual support networks with knock-on-door community care during crises. But this community resilience both mitigates disadvantage and masks underlying needs, and may lead to lower IMD scores despite genuine structural disadvantage. It is not all doom and gloom, however. The research team came up with key recommendations, which our local MPs will be championing in Westminster around measurement reform, housing strategy, service delivery, economic development, policy framework, and transport policy. As a diocese, we are having conversations about how the outcomes of this report will affect the work we do and how we do it. This research, focused on 6 areas in Cornwall, is not just for Cornwall, however. Our hope and prayer is that the government takes notice of this report and changes the way they measure deprivation in rural areas across the country. How might you and your organisation or church take the outcomes of pretty poverty and look at your context differently? What changes might need to be made in your local area to make a deep impact to those in need? You can find the report on the link that's going to go into the chat now, and on the Diocese of Truro website by searching for Pretty Poverty. Thank you for listening. I'm going to pass over to Lois, who's going to tell us more about Cumbria.
Thank you, Paul. I'm not going to be as polished as either Stephanie or Paul, I'm afraid. I'm just so excited that this is happening, though. This is exactly what we wanted when we ran the South Lakes Poverty Truth Commission. And from the very beginning, I was looking for church support, and I think this is the most wonderful thing. So who am I and why am I talking? So my name's Lois Sparling. I was the coordinator of the South Lakes Poverty Truth Commission from its inception in September 2022 until the commission itself finished at the end of December 2024. But it's still, our commissioners are still carrying on great work in various ways, and the ripples are still spreading. And this is one of those ripples, I reckon. Now I work as a community chaplain in Cockmouth and around in North Cumbria, and I am working very much with rural churches in a rural area and rural food share projects and so on, the kind of things that Stephanie and Paul have mentioned. And I'm also working as part of the Churches Together in Cumbria community social action team, and we're very concerned about poverty and what churches can do about poverty across our county. And I can see that my colleague Johnny Gios, who was part of setting this forum up today, is on the call, which is great, but he's a very busy man, so I'm glad he's here. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the South Lakes Poverty Truth Commission was, in case anybody doesn't know what a Poverty Truth Commission is, and there's information in the chat. I hope you've all encountered your local Poverty Truth Commissions where they've run. There have been at least 30 of them around the country. They're amazing, amazing projects, and if you get the opportunity to support them, please do. I can also see that Simon Blythe, who was the driving force behind the South Lakes Poverty Truth Commission, is on the call, and very glad to see him. And Jamie Hooper also from Westmorland Furness Council, who was also instrumental in some of the work we did. So I'm going to talk about the South Lakes Poverty Truth Commission very briefly, and then hand over to my good friend Jim, who knows so much more than me about rural poverty. We were also hoping to have Caroline Kearney on the call today. She was a lovely civic commissioner who practically chased me down after my first visit to Windermere Town Council, pleading to be allowed to take part in our work. But she can't be with us today, as her father passed away yesterday. Having brought up a family in Bowness while working in hospitality and retail, she would have corroborated what Paul and Stephanie have been saying. And I'm sure we're going to hear much more of that. So I also to say, I was so delighted to discover Stephanie's amazing Hidden Hardships work in 2024. It fits so well with the things that we'd found, but it happened after, we could have done with it before our Poverty Truth Commission. If you get a chance to watch the videos, there's a link to the videos that our Poverty Truth Commission has made in the chat. If you get the chance to watch This Is Our Home, that was the first video that we made, and it summarises that life in a tourist area for somebody without money, all of that. That was written and narrated by one of our community commissioners, Sarah Haynes, amazing woman. She would have loved to be here today, but she can't do online meetings, so she's still doing great work, but she couldn't take part in this. We were also delighted to hear about the Pretty Poverty Report when that came out, because that inadequacy of the indices of multiple deprivation is a real challenge in rural areas, and it would be brilliant if those could change. Paul talked a lot about transport, and one of the statistics that I drag up quite a lot, I hope it's true, I'm not sure whether it is that subsidy for public transport in London is 10 times more per head than in Cumbria. Per head. So it's not just that we don't have very many people in Cumbria and therefore we don't get very much money. We don't even get the same money per head because we're just not important enough. And I'm sure that's true of all rural areas, and it's shocking and appalling. And transport is very much at the heart of people's problems with access to services and so on. I also only discovered this week about the work of the Arthur Rank Centre, really. I probably haven't been paying attention, to promote better understanding of rural areas, which is something Stephanie's also connected with. And that slogan, Confident Rural Christians, I think it's really important that Christians have the confidence to engage with this work, and to see how vital they are in rural areas, or could be in rural areas. Felix, if there's something else I was going to say there. Oh yeah, something else about the Cumbrian, that thing about isolation. We have a very high rate of suicide in North Cumbria. It's one of the top in the country. And there's recently been a report out about that. The Cumberland Council commissioned some research into from John Moores University into why this might be the case. And it says that isolation is one of the key things. Isolation, lack of knowledge about services, and lack of access to services. So tell us something we don't know. But that's what happens in rural areas. So people have traumatic life events and then they can't access the support for them. So like everybody else, they have traumatic circumstances and they can't access help. So just quickly, what a South Lakes what a Poverty Truth Commission is. When we were set up when we started to set one up in autumn 2022, we were the first one in a rural area. And it's about bringing people with lived experience of poverty into relationship and conversations with people with the levers of power in the local area. So in the end, we brought together 10 people with lived experience of poverty for different reasons and in different parts of our area. And they sat down regularly for a year with 10 people who worked for councils or the health service, or local charities, or had other sorts of influence in the area, to build relationships, to talk with them about what was needed in our area. And we're incredibly proud that some of our community commissioners, including Jim, are still delivering training to local organisations on poverty awareness as a result of our work. And also still working very closely with Westmoreland Furness Council to poverty proof their policies and so on, which is exactly the sort of thing we wanted. Also particularly proud that our This Is Our Home video headlined at the Tourism Our Voice conference. I think that's fair to say, Kenny, in York last summer. Our commissioners were so proud to be invited to be part of that, and so glad that their voice was heard in that space. And incredibly proud to hear from Kenny last week that our video was part of a submission to a select committee on tourism, I think only last week or maybe the week before. So we did achieve something in that short period of time. We hoped it would only be the first South Lakes Poverty Truth Commission because we scratched the surface, but at the moment it's the South Lakes Poverty Truth Commission. I would say key findings of our work, just very briefly, that there are all sorts of hidden poverty caused by all sorts of different life events in rural areas, and they are more traumatic. They are technically traumatic because people experience them on their own, not as part of a community of people going through the same thing. So that isolation turns it into trauma. They're isolated, they're unsupported, they're not understood. That what those people with lived experience want is that people facing such life events and circumstances in future be better connected to, better aware of, and better supported by local services. They want truly inclusive community hubs with good presence from, links with local services. And there's someone else on this call who probably doesn't want me to draw attention to her, but who was also one of our commissioners, who has run exactly such a project, and they're absolute lifelines. And the other thing that people want is person-centred services. They want the health service, the council, the job centre to understand that they are people who live with experience of trauma. They are people who cannot always fill out forms easily or turn up to appointments easily or manage their lives to fit in with the services that are supposed to be supporting them for so many reasons. And thirdly, that to design policy without the wisdom of the people who've lived it is madness. I learned so much in those 2 years, and services could learn so much. And on that note, I'm going to hand you over to Jim Webster, who is a cattle farmer, one of our community commissioners, but also church warden, serial volunteer for all sorts of brilliant agricultural charities, and chair of Barrow Food Bank, so that he can share just a little of his wisdom, which, if you're interested, you can find every week on the South Lakes Poverty Truth Commission Facebook page. Over to you, Jim.
Hiya. Right. Amongst other things, I act as a farming community network volunteer casework. And I felt I could give you a feeling for some of the issues that I'm starting to come across. Just to give you a feeling for how poverty can play out in farming. And so I'll focus on one particular area where this hits. Over the last 2 years, I've come across several cases where I'm called in to help a farmer who's got behind with the paperwork. Sometimes it's animal health or trading standards who realise that they have a farmer with severe problems. Sometimes it's a desperate phone call from the farmer. So I phone and talk to the farmer. The story is a long one. Sometimes it goes back more than 40 years. They were born on a comparatively small farm. They were the quiet one and stayed at home working when siblings went off got real jobs, married, had families, earned money, all that sort of stuff. The one I'm dealing with is somewhere on one spectrum or another. They grow older. If they're milking cows,
Jim's internet is terrible. I imagine it'll come back.
hello, I'm back. Hello? Yeah,
Yes.
Hi, Jim. Thank you.
I have rural broadband. It's slower than dial-up. Welcome to the early 1980s. Anyway, as I was saying, these guys grow older. They're milking cows are working 12-hour days, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. Take me as an example. I don't celebrate New Year's Eve. I was up for 30-something consecutive New Year's mornings at 5 a.m. as usual to milk. That's what dairy farming means. Anyway, these guys don't get out much. Not with 12-hour days. They never marry because they've no real income, no real prospects, no real people skills, not much of a catch. Slowly they evolve into becoming the carers for their parents. Now they're male. Remember, men don't have much contact with GPs. I know that for my lady wife, maternity is GP led, then they're screening for this and for that. For me, once I was immune to ringworm, basically I dealt with A&E. Also, they're self-employed. So the benefits system doesn't work for them. On top of that, they're still trying to do the same amount of farm work, but they're having to nip into the house at regular intervals to check up on the surviving parent. As for the care services, that's a nightmare. They have no contact with social services. They might be a bit vague as to which office in which town covers their area. Not only that, but frankly, they're terrified of them. After all, if mum goes into a home, who pays? She has no money, but might own a farm. Will a local authority sell it to cover care, leaving you homeless and unemployed? Then when your last surviving parent died, it doesn't get any much easier. Has there been a will? Do your surviving siblings expect the farm to be sold so they get their share? If it's a tenancy, is your name on the tenancy? Even if this isn't a problem, remember you're now in late middle age, often they're in their early 60s. Because you've been on low income for years, you've got no private pension. And just to put this in context, I had 3 consecutive years of negative income. Anyway, you no longer got your mother's pension coming in because for some years that would have been the main family household source of income. Because of the hours you work, you've no cooking skills. But somebody who's just worked 12 hours and needs to be in bed in another 3, you cannot be bothered with cooking anyway. And remember, for the past few years, as well as having to work those long hours and to keep the farm running properly, you have to take time out to get your parent to the doctor, house calls, forget it. Do the shopping, get stuff from the chemist, whatever. So you've had half a decade of getting more and more behind. Then some inspector appears in the app. This thing has to be fixed, or that has to be done, or this paperwork is out of date. And why haven't you got the cattle passports and those animals? You're left with documents that explain what has to be done and by when, and the penalties if you don't, and a threat of prosecution if they're not happy with the results, because you're not a person, you're a business. You're not actually a real person. And so you have somebody ridiculously stressed. In the case of one chap I was helping, I did convince him to see his GP. She then phoned me with his permission, asking me how on earth he'd ended up this stress. The problem is that the standard reactions to stress are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. The ones who've gone to fight won't hit me. They'll be grumpy, but I can cope with grumpy. I've been in agriculture all my life. Fawn is a nightmare for the inspectorate. The farmer will promise anything, everything. They just won't do anything, but they're incapable. They're frozen. Freeze is similar. I had one farmer who dare not leave his yard because he was always expecting yet another threatened, unannounced inspection. For me, the tricky one was flight. Obviously, they don't run away, but instead they just don't answer the phone, ever. It took me 2 months to get one person to answer the phone call. And to do this, I had to send his vicar around because the clergy is still expected to make visits and are entitled to. As an FCN casework volunteer, I do not go on a farm unless I'm invited, because if I go on uninvited, I'm no better than the inspector. Anyway, when we get to this stage, it can take me well over a year to help a farmer get back onto an even keel. Chatting on the phone, turning up to see how he's getting on, helping him prioritise, dealing with late cattle passports, etc. But remember, he's still skint. He's still barely surviving economically, and he's still got petty officialdom who have their own timetable. And at this point, I'll shut up. I might start to run.
Thank you so much, Jim. Handing back, Gav.
Thank you. I was trying to find the unmute myself button. We've got about 15 minutes left, and the idea now is to have a bit of an open conversation. You might want to feedback on some points from your breakout rooms, or you might want to address the questions we talked about, which is, I guess there was two main aims from today. Really, part of it is the connection, hearing what's going on in different places and potentially linking up with that. But also a bit of a discussion on what could be done differently, whether that's by charities, by churches, by government, or by some other system or organisation. By all means, put things in the chat box if you prefer that to speaking publicly, or there is a raise hand option at the bottom of your screen, I think, if you want to chip in. But yeah, over to the floor. Jim.
With regards to what government could do, I think some form of rural proofing and some grasp of how rural differs. For example, looking at the things that the government was talking about doing or doing in the last couple of days. So, for example, free buses for children in August, which is great if you have buses. But those that need the most don't actually have the buses. And the other thing was that they were also talking about supermarkets holding the prices down. Well, the supermarkets told them to run up a shutter because it's nonsense. But if they had fallen in with it, it's rural people who would have taken the hit because it had been their wages that had been held down to keep the prices down. So there's this feeling that the rural population is ignored or sacrificed to whoever has the most votes.
Just to add what Jim was saying about rural proofing, I'm really pleased to hear about that. There is a rural proofing document. I think it was issued by the Association of Communities in Rural England, ACRE, A-C-R-E. If you want to search, I'm sure it's their document. And one of the things when I was working in the voluntary and community sector, we ensured and provided was help to use that rural proofing document locally. It's not something I've heard much about in the last year, 18 months. So I think I will start to bring that up at various meetings I attend. It gives a start and it gives a ground, a way of starting those conversations as to how new projects are being shaped and delivered so that rurality is not ignored.
Can I just chip in on the rural proofing document? Because I'm actually a trustee of ACRE and ACRE has done a lot. The problem is that rural proofing is the responsibility of DEFRA, and there are few government departments with less influence in Westminster than DEFRA, because all that rural proofing does is it imposes costs on government. So rural proofing is not a popular concept, and we'll have to fight to get any done whatsoever.
Yeah, agree, but it's worth the fight.
Thanks, Jim.
I was involved last week in some interesting discussions with a group of community groups in Shropshire who are exploring trying to build better links between community projects like the pantries that we run directly with growers, farmers, suppliers of food, sort of bypassing and trying to disrupt the injustices in the food system that they see, and with rural communities being food deserts in many respects. That was interesting. But there's all enormous amounts of questions and challenges about that as an idea. I'd be interested if anyone has had any experiences of things like that happening on the ground in different parts of the country.
Ruth, were you waiting to come in a second ago?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to pick up in response to the question of what else can we do as a group? I do know that there are a group of MPs that are looking at market towns and coastal town issues. And because, as I said earlier, we went to, as Pretty Poverty, we went to London to raise this with a group of MPs on the report that we've done. And I think it's an opportunity now to think about how do we take it the next step? How can we how as a church can we get involved in those conversations at a national level? Because if there's already a group of MPs looking at it, rather than try and reinvent something, how can we link in with what they're doing to push a more national agenda? I'm quite happy to pick it up with our local MP who helped us to get that time and space in Westminster to do that, and see if there's an opportunity for us to link in any way.
Thank you, Ruth. I think Suzanne had a hand up and then Helen.
Yeah, it's just something I raised in our session. So just wondering if anybody on the call has experience or works in areas, rural areas that aren't necessarily coastal or agriculture, and don't have things like tourism, employment. So I'm particularly thinking in Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire, ex-mining communities and places that where their local industry in that rural setting has been decimated and nothing else has been put in its place. So interested in chatting to anybody that is working around those sort of areas.
Well, I'd like to make two suggestions. On the rural areas, there's an all-party parliamentary group for rural MPs, which lots of them will belong to. It'll probably have a membership of 50, if not more. So maybe, you know, sending them or asking them for a meeting and presenting to them the Truro document and maybe, you know, the other presentations we've had today, but being clear about what the ask is. You know, is the ask number one ask transport? Is the number one ask housing? Like being specific. With respect to Nottingham, Derbyshire, Coventry and the former mining areas, there is the Coalfields Community Campaign and the Coalfield Regeneration Trust. So I think it would be worth linking up with either of them. And they have a bit of money, which is amazing.
Thanks, Helen. Jim?
We did actually raise the issue of land ownership, and I hope people will pursue that in their particular areas. The other aspect which links in part the urban context with rural context is the kind of question mark as to whether it's okay, as Father Our Faith is concerned, to actually have a second home when some people don't have any home. Is that okay? So how would we view that if we were asked for advice about buying a second home? How would we respond to that, you know, in relation to that issue of homelessness in rural areas as well as the urban areas?
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, Lois, I can see you put a few things in the chat as well. Did you want to sort of elaborate on any of those in the meeting?
I was just thinking the person who just mentioned the Coalfield Regenerations Fund. I mean, I do work. Part of my patch is ex-mining villages. You know, not farming, not coastal, not and yet they do seem to have money. Although our local one is already spent up until August, so people know about it. I was just commenting that the way that the urban areas get things like Pride in Place money around here, and they hit the IMD. So Barrow gets a lot of money because there is a technically deprived area according to the IMD, but rural areas get money when someone wants to build a solar farm or a wind farm, and there's compensation, which isn't a great way for us to get money, or when they want to bury nuclear waste. So in a way, there are pots of money for rural areas, but they're not great pots. I mean, but there is money. I don't think money is necessarily the answer, though. From the experience of the Poverty Truth Commission, it's more better access to services and more understanding services when you access them. So that's an awareness raising thing, I think, probably, and poverty proofing and rural proofing of all the statutory services would be brilliant, and government. I think that's all I want to say. I've talked enough.
Maria.
Thank you. I just wanted to come back. I think it was Suzanne who raised the issue about rural areas that are not leafy and coastland and agricultural. And in our group, I mentioned that we can also talk about remote areas. And there is a body of work done internationally, but also within the UK, looking at such remote areas. And if there's been really some fantastic work done in Australia and Canada that look at remote areas, because some of the same issues come up, but they're not in the sort of traditional rural way that we might think about rural.
Thanks, Maria.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to. Yeah, I think so. Maybe a change in terminology would be helpful because of the association with rural. I mean, when I say coastal, I mean our coastal isn't rural. Our coastal is ex-industrial, but maybe remote is the thing. I mean, I think that's the sense in which Cumbria is an entirely rural county, is because it's cut off. It's a long way from the centre of power, and it's a long way from, except in the sort of southeast corner. 500,000 people in a very low population density across which we're all spread. So, yeah, maybe remote is a better way of talking about it. And language matters, doesn't
it? Thank you, Liz. Is anybody else waiting to come in? We're sort of in the final moments now. We've kept to time, which is always an achievement. I don't want to overrun approaching lunchtime. I can't see any more hands. Jim Webster.
Just to follow up on the problems of rural and dispersed population, in theory, there should be a hospital for every 500,000 people. This means there's no justifiable reason for a hospital in Cumbria because we don't have the population to justify a big one, which would give the staff all the training and meet all the things they need. So it's a constant battle to keep hospitals in Cumbria because every time they try and reorganise, they try and reorganise things more centrally. So the latest battle has been to stop them moving maternity out of the south of the county altogether. Otherwise, most of our children will be born on the A590 waiting for the air ambulance to meet with the ambulance that's stuck in the traffic jam.
Thanks, Jim. I can see that lots of people already have been sharing email addresses in the chat.
Peter, sorry, Gav, I've just seen Peter Collins has got his hand up there.
Oh, sorry, I missed that.
That's okay. That's okay. It seems to me that out of this discussion, there are two elements emerging. We need two sorts of strategy, don't we? We are not without influence, so we need a strategy that directs, in a sense, our righteous anger, outrage, toward those in power who have the ability and the opportunity to influence policy and change things for the better. And we also need strategies directed towards programs and initiatives that help the people that we're seeking to help. And I think out of this morning's discussion, if we could give some thought to how we develop, in a sense, those two prongs as a charity and as campaigners, then that would be a fruitful outcome from this morning's discussion.
Thanks, Peter. That feels like a very constructive note to finish on. Thank you very much. Yeah, I can see lots of people have shared email addresses already, which is great. In terms of what's going to happen next, I'll send an email out later, hopefully this afternoon or tomorrow morning, just checking again if anybody else is happy to share their addresses. We'll make the recording available as well. We'll put a post of the recording on the Church Action on Poverty Facebook page, and I'll put a link in to that on the email, so that if people want to carry on the discussion online as well, there's an option to do that. And yeah, I think there's a strong possibility that as a result of this, there'll be other things happening and other meetups, either online again or in person. So it'd be lovely to keep in touch. Great, thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you very
Thank you
much.
very much,
Thank
Gav,
you,
for
everyone.
organising.
Lovely to
Thank you,
meet you all.
everybody.
Stay well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.